World War I, World War II, most of the battlefield injuries were caused by artillery shells. Whereas at the moment, over 80% of the battlefield injuries are being caused by drones. And the headline, of course, is that despite Russia's mass, despite Russia being on the front foot, Ukraine has effectively halted Russia in its tracks, largely because there's huge buffer zones now where if you move, you die. And it's all around drones.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 1254 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or full-scale war against Ukraine, we're privileged to be talking to Sean Bell. Now, Sean's a former RAF fighter pilot, a Harrier pilot, actually. And one of my best experiences in the RAF was flying in a Harrier T-10. There we go. Former Air Vice Marshal, now a military analyst, co-founder of Red Matrix Productions, I think they are, and the High Ground podcasts. And, of course, you're an ambassador for the RAF Association. Sean, welcome to Frontline.
Philip, delight to be here. And I hadn't realised you'd flown in a Harrier as well. We'll have to talk about that some stage.
Well, exactly. No, that was a fantastic experience, but we will talk about that later. But there's a lot in the news going on around Ukraine, and a lot of it is political. It's rare that we get a military expert such as you. So I want to drill into some of the geek stuff that's out there, and in particular, drones and drone warfare. We've just had the Strategic Defence Review in the UK. People are talking about different aircraft types and all the rest of it, but we've got drones coming up all of the time. In your view, has the mass proliferation of cheap, effective drones made traditional air power doctrine around expensive crewed aircraft fundamentally obsolete? Does the book need to be rewritten?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not the first time, as you'd imagine, we asked this with a defence review going on. I think it's a very reasonable question. I think one of the things having been out to Ukraine a few times, I think we've got to be quite careful here. Let's go zoom right out. Ukraine is a battle between David and Goliath. Ukraine has about 37 million population, I think. Russia is about 5 times the size. Ukraine has got sort of older, less capable Soviet kit, and Russia would have fully expected to just roll over Ukraine. Remember that 40-mile convoy and everything. Amazingly, Ukraine survived, and over the last few years, gradually the West has stepped up support. But at its heart, what Ukraine has to avoid is a mass-on-mass fight. You know, those days when you turned up on the battlefield, everyone had a cup of tea and then set at each other, and largely the biggest side won. Well, Russia is the biggest side, and therefore, if Ukraine was to get dragged into a war of attrition, it would lose. And the one thing that the West has managed to do is provide Ukraine with high-tech weapons. And one of the great things they've done is they've started to exploit unmanned air vehicles, drones particularly, lightweight, small. And I think for me, the big statistic is, like you, World War I, World War II, most of the battlefield injuries were caused by artillery shells. Whereas at the moment, over 80% of the battlefield injuries are being caused by drones. And the headline, of course, is that despite Russia's mass, despite Russia being on the front foot, Ukraine has effectively halted Russia in its tracks, largely because there's huge buffer zones now where if you move, you die. And it's all around drones.
Well, the traditional front line used to be defined, tactical front line, used to be defined as to the range of direct fire weapons and influence of indirect fire weapons, so the artillery that you're talking about. But we've now got the Ukrainians with long-range drones that are hitting thousands of kilometres away. But again, if we look at the way the conflict went on, the first thing that any soldier wants before you go in the ground is for the Air Force to have air superiority and provide that protective bubble so that it can't be influenced from the air. We haven't seen that. And the Russians had on paper, the second largest air force in the world, I think, or greatest capability. And they didn't manage to achieve it whenever they first went into Ukraine. And they never seem to have managed to achieve even local air superiority over the front line of the minute. Why do you think that's happened?
I think there's several reasons. I think one of the key ones is they don't have an independent air force, so that's still an air arm of the army. And I can go into legions of reasons why the Royal Air Force was formed in 1918, and much to the chagrin of some of my army colleagues. But actually, many air forces have followed that lead as you've gone along. The other thing is that Russia traditionally misidentifies equipment as capability. If you look at the Russian Air Force, it's got some pretty impressive aircraft. But unless you do, we used to call it PAN-DLOD, Defence Lines of Development. It's not just about the
equipment.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
You know, scratching my head a bit. But it was lots of things like, was it tepid oil, training, equipment, infrastructure, all those sorts of things. Unless you invest in them all, that equipment you can't turn into capability. And the Russians have singularly failed to be able to turn what should be dominance in the equipment, to be able to create an air umbrella over the front line and make life utterly untenable for the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, Russia's lost quite a lot of aircraft. It hasn't synchronized its efforts well, and it's almost licking its wounds, and it's allowing the Ukrainians to actually take the fight to them. I mean, most recently, was it the Spider's Web strike?
Fascinating.
I mean, just look at that. You think Russia moved all its heavy bombers away outside drone range, thinking they were safe. Next thing, probably a year or two in the planning, out of a box, a whole load of drones fly out, land on the wings, blow up, a whole load of bears, backfires and mainstays, 2 bombers and 1 intelligence aircraft. And although we counted the numbers, and of course we went, it's a significant proportion of the bomber fleet, it was far worse than that for the Russians because they had only flown the aircraft away that were serviceable. As you well know, Russia's famous for cannibalizing its aircraft. So the proportion of their fleet that was actually flown away, that was serviceable, was most of them, and a good number of those were taken out. We've already seen, even in this country, fewer efforts by Russia and its air force to penetrate UK airspace, largely because they're hurting.
Well, we'll not talk about different air forces that cannibalize their aircraft to keep others going, because that would be a different discussion. But you mentioned the long-range bombers and the importance of long-range bombers, and a historic role of air power has always been the ability to strike with precision, deep strike behind enemy lines. But now we're seeing again, the Russians are using deep strike, but randomly against civilian population and everything else. The Ukrainians are being much more surgical with their very long-range drones, and not just Operation Spider's Web, but they're actually flying drones from Ukraine thousands of kilometers to hit critical military infrastructure, logistic infrastructure, factories, oil refineries, and all the rest of it. Is this changing the thinking behind how we provide that deep strike capability in the future? Or are we just harping back to what happened effectively during the Second World War with the V1 and V2s?
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question. I'll come at the specifics of that. But if you look at what Ukraine's trying to do, what is it? Why is it striking inside Russia? Is that actually going to change the course of the war? Are they actually materially stopping Russia supporting the war effort? The answer to that is no. What they're trying to do is make sure the Russian population recognise they are in a war. And also, they've been very effective at targeting the oil infrastructure for Russia because, of course, that's how they finance the war, and the more you can take that out. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that whilst we in the West have some pretty healthy technology around drones, the actual drone itself is an engine, it's a fuel tank and wings and a bit of a sensor. But that makes it sound, it's easy to build it. The difficulty is flight testing, assurance and all that. That takes years. The beauty with Ukraine is you can send a box of bits to Ukraine that hasn't ever been flight tested, doesn't come with a warranty. Ukraine goes, we're at war, we don't care. They bolt it together and send it flying. And they've been very effective at causing a little bit of carnage in Russia. I think it feels a little bit like, though, you're on a picnic and the wasps are irritating you. They're not going to stop your picnic. They're just a bit of an irritation. And that's what President Zelensky and the drones have done for the long-distance drones. I do think we've, going back to your major point, though, is this a rethink? I think the danger is we look at one war. You and I have been part of the military and we focus everything on that. If I can just give one example of the opposite side of that, Israel and Iran, they don't share a land border, and Israel mounted a very, very clever attack against Iran. 24 hours, rolled back their air defences, and now operated over Iran, over Tehran, with impunity with their modern fighter jets, causing carnage, surgical strike and the like. And if you were to look at our country, do we have a land border with someone like Russia? No. We have a moat. No, I know it's a little bit bigger than a moat, but effectively we have a moat. And therefore, the analogy for us is more, we can use air power for surgical strike at distance, at pace. The one thing the drones don't do is they don't hit targets very quickly. And as you and I both know, your intelligence, sharp intelligence, it's fleeting. You need to be able to strike it pretty quickly. Drones can't do that. They take a long time to get to their target.
Yeah, and it's a protection as well that's in there. And we seem to have traditionally focused on very expensive, capable protection. The Russians, in particular, their new S-400s, and the S-300s in Iran didn't provide them any protection for the Israeli stealth aircraft that were going in. In Ukraine, again, the drones are getting through. But are we learning lessons for how we then provide air defence, that air defence capability on the ground, both from almost an operational level air defence down to a tactical level air defence? And do you think that's something that's going to be reflected in the outcome of the British Defence Review?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, isn't there? I think the S-300, S-400, the Russians have always claimed, I mean, let's face it, when I was flying and the sort of earlier versions of those, we were scared of them. Because the Russians never turned them on. They came with a very impressive sales manual.
As they always do. The Russians are very good in the information domain.
Exactly. But of course, they've had to use them in Ukraine. And all of a sudden, the West has hoovered up all of the radio frequencies that are used, what ranges they operate at, what effect do they have. And that is massively undermined. That actually the reality of their capability is significantly worse. I think the one lesson that you do have to take from that is that it doesn't matter how capable your system is, you can flood those defences. A good example of that is out in Israel with Hamas firing thousands of rockets at Israel itself. And they've used the Iron Dome. And that's a very effective system that effectively differentiates, right? Which of these are going to hit a target, need to take that out. Those that are not, let them fall. And I think, but if you can literally, if it can deal with 10 missiles, then send 100 at it. And I think that's what we're seeing with this very, very expensive high-tech equipment, that it can't deal with quantity. It can deal with quality, but not quantity.
But then, Israel, geographically, you've got something that's fixed. It's relatively small, so it's easy to put an Iron Dome over that over a long period of time. Try doing that on something the size of Ukraine and all the rest of it. But again, we're seeing, as happens in every conflict, the adaptation of tactics. And we're seeing the Russian increasing use of glide bombs in providing what's almost close air support. In attacking into Ukrainian defensive positions. For those that are listening and watching, can you tell people what a glide bomb is and how that sort of ups the threat to those in defensive positions?
Yes, I mean, there's various sort of munitions, but if you have a powered munition, it's generally quite expensive. So Storm Shadow is a powered munition, sort of like a cruise missile, cost us £2 million a copy. But of course, it flies itself at a fair old speed. The cheapest weapons are dumb weapons that just free fall down. The trouble is with a free fall weapon, effectively started off with light aircraft throwing hand grenades out the side of a light aircraft. It follows a parabola, free fall into the ground. The trouble with that is you have to get quite close to the target. The clever thing about the glide weapons is that now, rather than just falling, it does what Buzz Lightyear said, fall with style, and therefore it sort of glides, it flies itself, so you get a much greater range. And if these things are delivered from 30,000 feet, they'll go out to at least 50 kilometres. It means that the Russian aircraft can stay well back away from the danger area, and these bombs fly in. The downside of that is that they use energy. So if I was to drop a pebble from height, it will hit the ground at a certain speed. If it's having to fly, it will inevitably lose energy all the way. And also, where's it actually going to strike? You still need to be guided in some way. The Russians are not good at that. So they are basically using these big bombs, glide them towards the front line. But of course, because the front line's got so static of late, that all the Ukrainians are down in their bunkers. Yes, it's causing them a bit of a headache and their eardrums are ringing for a few moments. But in the early days, it was really damaging. As the front line gets more static, because of the drones that are creating this buffer zone, the glide bombs are not so effective. And it also means that the Russian aircraft are having to get a little bit closer than they'd like to the front line. That has made them more vulnerable, especially to surprise attacks from Ukraine. And last I saw, it was well over 10% of the Russian fighter aircraft have now been shot down in this conflict. And you think, Ukraine hasn't got any aircraft to shoot them down, and they haven't got that many. Back to our earlier analogy that they Christmas tree a lot of these, so they haven't got that many that are serviceable. That's a big price to pay by Russia.
Yeah, 10% shot down of the serviceable aircraft. That's an even bigger percentage of what the Russians will be flying. But we've heard an awful lot about F-16 whenever it was coming in. And that would solve all the Ukrainian Air Force problems and everything else. That would have a massive impact. And some have been delivered, they've been dribbled in. We've seen some fantastic pictures of F-16s flying with sophisticated weapons on them. We've heard of a couple being shot down, but we've heard of some successes. Have they got a real role? Are they something that the Ukrainians can make proper use of? What's holding them back at the moment from having that impact that the naive commentators, not us, went out and came out with as soon as someone mentioned delivering F-16s to the Russians? Or sorry, to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm old enough and ugly enough to have been involved in this discussion right the way from the start. And President Zelensky was asking for fighter, because you remember at the start of the war we weren't providing anything. Then we provided anti-tank weapons. Then we provided long-range missiles. Then we provided tanks. And gradually, the amount of aid that the West has supported has gradually escalated. Zelensky said, right, I need modern fighter jets. And the West effectively said, look, even if we parked 100 F-16s on the front lawn outside Kyiv, you wouldn't know what to do with them. The pilot inside takes years of training. And even when we in the West, some of the best training in the world, we're brought up with these sort of aircraft. You get combat ready on an aircraft. You are now like a 17-year-old who's just passed his driving test. Stick, search, report. You are not credible until you've done a full 3 years on the front line. Fold that to Ukraine now. Where are they going to get these pilots from? If they take them off their MiG-29s, if they take them off their current fighter fleet, who's going to fly those? These are the warriors of the sky that are their saviours at the moment. If you put ab initios through, it'll be 3 or 4 years before they actually end up on the front line. The prevailing view at the time was F-16s are a great idea once the war is over, because Ukraine is going to need its own indigenous, credible air power capability. And the West's view was, we have the aircraft ready when the war is over. What we need to do is lean into it, get you some of the pilots through pilot training so that as soon as the war is over, here's the jets, here's the air crew. Right now you can start learning on the job and maybe have a few Western pilots folded in as well. Zelensky said, no, I want them now. So, of course, they started to drip feed them in. It's proven that actually I think 2 or 3 have been shot down. They're involved. They don't have the best radars. They don't have the best software. So they can't sort of one-on-one fight with their Russian counterparts. I think the most modern F-16 is a 1991 vintage when it was built. I hesitate to ask, but what was your mobile phone looking like in 1991? That's the level of technology that was available at the time. So they're still a very good aeroplane. You can bolt lots of very sexy weapons on there, but they're largely being used to shoot down cruise missiles and Shahed drones that are heading deeper in the country. I read somewhere that they were also freeing up the Ukrainian Air Force to take on the Russians on the front line. I was very privileged when I was out in Ukraine to go and visit some of those the Ukrainian pilots on the front line. They want to go nowhere near it. They are losing pilots and aircraft very, very quick. Tragically, 2 of the pilots last year have drowned. Why? Because they didn't even have basic life-saving jackets, which we always flew with. And as you know, aircrew are pretty laden down with G-suits and everything else. If you land in water, you're going to sink and you're going to die unless you have one. A lot of the Ukrainian pilots don't have them. And therefore, the Ukraine is about survival. And I suspect the F-16s, they have a role. They're being flown by some very brave young men. I think it's all young men over there at the moment. But frankly, it's a bit early for them. And I don't think they're going to make a really crucial, decisive contribution to the war anytime soon.
But then if you've got your 17-year-olds who've just passed their test and they're learning to drive, shooting down cruise missiles is a good way of learning to drive. The complexity of trying to change your equipment whilst you're fighting a high-intensity conflict, whether it be on the ground and in tanks, you're going from a crew of 3 in the old Soviet tanks to a crew of 4. You're changing dynamics down at that tiny level. And the same with the Air Force. Can you give listeners, because I don't think people understand this, lots of people say, just give the Ukrainians the kit and they'll be able to go out and win the war. No, you have to know how to fight the kit. And to fight in an all-arms army perspective, it takes the British Army 2 years for a trained professional formation to go from basic skills to fighting together. And that's before we then start to integrate Air Force. From an Air Force perspective, how complex is it working all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complex. I mean, if you go back to sort of World War II and you're in your Spitfire and you're looking in the skies waiting for a German aircraft to come over and you take it on and it's a gladiatorial battle to the death. A modern fighter pilot, yes, he's got to sit there and fly his aeroplane. Frankly, up, down, left, right, faster, slow. That's the same in any aeroplane. But
those are the instructions I had when I was in the Harrier.
Oh, there we go. How difficult could it be? But the real role of today's fighter pilot is situational awareness.
Yeah.
There is a massive equipment telling you a huge amount of data. Also, you've got to listen. You've got 2 radios going on in your headset, all of which you've got to blank out but pick up odd key words because there's an intelligence aircraft that's out there scanning the skies, providing a picture. You've got to pick that up. There's also all sorts of other intelligence for other aircraft who've picked up targets. You've therefore got another package of aircraft around you. That situational awareness of what's going on around you is something that the best example I can give for the viewers is when you first drove your car, your head was inside the car, looking at the gear stick, looking at the pedals, looking at the steering wheel and the bonnet. Now when you drive the car, you're looking a mile ahead of the car. You can see things happening ahead because the driving of the car is second nature. Unfortunately, in a fighter jet, that takes a couple of years. We do exercises like Red Flag in the US, which is a culmination, 100 aircraft against a credible enemy. Day one, even with all this training, you're all shot down. And at 2 weeks of intensive training and you start to get better at it. That is the role of the modern fighter. That's why we don't have many of these fighter jets. But my goodness, the warriors are inside there are very well trained. And it's an incredibly difficult job.
Now, you're changing tack slightly and going a little bit higher. You've mentioned the Russians' availability of the aircraft. There's increasing reports coming through, and we've been commentating, both of us, on this about Russia relying on parts from and complete pieces of equipment from North Korea, the drone technology from Iran. We're getting more reports of Chinese involvement and the Chinese kit that they're relying on. Donald Trump has just changed his ultimatum from 50 days to 10 to 12 days if it happens, but with secondary sanctions going on, the likes of China, India, and everywhere else. Do you think that's going to have an impact on Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war if he follows through? And that's probably the biggest word in the English language, if.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a fascinating conversation because you and I both know President Putin is not going to stop because Sir Keir Starmer pleads with him to stop, or the United Nations waves a letter at him. History shows that the only way Russia will stop is when it achieves its objectives or if it's forced to stop. And the ways to force it to stop are either economically or militarily. I may be wrong, but I see no appetite at the moment for anybody in the West to get directly involved militarily. We are providing support, but one might argue we're providing enough support for Ukraine not to lose, not enough to help it win. But economically, sanctions, I'm not a great believer in sanctions, but the one tool that President Trump has at his, if he was to put a tariff like 100% on every country that dealt with Russian oil, that would be very difficult. Now, there are some countries that would therefore find it very difficult. China is an ally of Russia, but I suspect if you study China, and I think you probably study it more than I have, it's probably going to look after its own interests, which are probably not served by throwing its towel in with Russia. India, difficult, might see a slight tilt towards Russia, but it knows it can't afford. And that would actually suddenly mean that Russian oil, which is what funds the war, that might force President Putin into doing something. The challenge, of course, is exactly as you say, is what's the little acronym that TACO that's doing the round? Trump always chickens out.
Yes.
And that's probably very unfair. But, you know, if he genuinely wants to stop the war, and I do believe President Trump passionately believes that he wants to stop the fighting. Unfortunately, there's some difficult decisions to make, either militarily or economically. If he was to put those levels of tariffs on, I think it's a game changer for the conflict.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. China is focused on one thing only, and that's China.
Yeah.
And everything that it does, it will have something that it will want for itself for the future, which is why BRICS and all the rest of it doesn't work, because all of the BRICS members are focused on themselves. But you talked about the economic pressure that there is and the military pressure in stopping the war. The other bit is the social pressure. And you touched on that earlier whenever you said part of the Ukrainian tactic of flying the long-range drones into attacking Russian capability is bringing the war to the Russian public. And we saw the social pressure ending Russia's involvement in Afghanistan many years ago. We're not quite seeing that at the moment. But we saw Russian airline Aeroflot hit with a massive cyber attack. Belarusian cyber actors who support Ukraine effectively destroying all of the data of Aeroflot and causing real disasters. Do you think we're going to see more and more of that, trying to bring this social understanding of what's going on and use the social element as another tool of warfare in trying to get Putin onto the negotiating table?
Yeah, the trouble is, I think there is a great deal of merit in some of those approaches, but I have to say the cynic in me says, bluntly, history suggests that it's much, much simpler than that. Putin's going to continue. He controls the narrative back at home. The one thing he's struggling with is the widows, the mothers, the children. They gradually have an increasing voice in all of this. I think what's fascinating, I don't think there's war weariness in Russia. I mean, frankly, most of the Muscovites go around their business, a day-to-day business as usual. I think what is interesting, my first visit to Ukraine, I got this sense of resilience and defiance from everybody. We're going to push the Russians out. When you and I were doing some time with a different broadcaster, I remember one of the interpreters pulling me aside over coffee. She was Ukrainian. She kept saying, "Why are you so downbeat about Ukraine? We're going to kick Russia out." My latter visit, most recently, only a few months back, there was a much more sense of, we need to bring this war to an end. We are paying a huge price for this. You walk around the streets of Kyiv. It's a beautiful city, but there's not many fighting age men around. If you go to Maidan Square and see the flags fluttering, it's not a few hundred, a few thousand, a few tens of thousands. There are huge numbers. That I found it really moving. It's a bit like going to the war cemeteries in France and just the poignancy of it all. And likewise in the West, I do think, Europe for a while was on a different course to America. America went, this is nothing to do with us. We're focused on China. And Europe went, it's on our continent. What are we going to do? And that created a panic. We've given away all of our weapons stockpiles, so we need to rearm. But that means abandoning Ukraine. And if Russia takes Ukraine, that increases the threat. We're more vulnerable. And I think that's created a little hint of panic now in the West. And that's why I think we're seeing a massive increase in defence spending. The problem is, as you know, you can throw more money at it, but unless you've got the factories there producing this stuff, it takes years. Putin's got his war economy on a war footing at the moment. We have not.
Well, and it's not just the money, it's the understanding. And, you and I know well from our military times that we're brilliant at writing lessons learned papers. And then a few years later, writing exactly the same lessons learned. And we've learned that lesson and we're going to implement it.
Lesson identified,
and we're doing that again. If you're, we've got a new Chief of the Air Staff coming into the UK. If you were sitting down advising him as to what the priorities should be for the Royal Air Force with the lessons that we're pulling out of Ukraine, but also with an eye on what's going on or going to happen potentially in the future, what would you be saying to him?
Well, I know Harv Smith, the new Chief of the Air Staff. He was a Harrier guy as well.
Yeah. I thought you might.
Yeah, no, he worked with me, and he was an incredibly sharp individual.
Yeah. And of course, he's from Northern Ireland as well, which adds an extra dimension.
Yeah, apart from that, though. But no, but he was exceptionally gifted guy, and he remains a gifted guy. He was also the first guy to run Space Command. So he knows about warfare. So the last thing I would do is ever advise him. I think what was fascinating, and a couple of weeks ago, there was the annual Air and Space Power Association Global Air Chiefs Conference in London. Harv Smith was there, as was Rich Knighton saying his farewells. I think there were a couple of lessons that came out there which resonated with me. One of them was that in your and my time, we made assumptions about war fighting and how big our stockpiles needed to be. This war has shown that the sort of stockpiles we thought were credible are probably less than a day's worth of material. And what are you going to do when that runs out? Because the factory that produces them was shut down. You can't nip down to Sainsbury's and buy a few more. Other supermarkets are available. So that would be one of them. The other one, I think, that came out was, and I think going back full circle to when you started with drones, it's the ability overnight to constantly innovate, to bring that technology in. That's one thing that in the Cold War, I'm old enough and ugly enough to have been part of that. We had electronic warfare. You develop a new measure, the Russians developed a countermeasure, we develop a counter. There was constantly a market of innovation. In the last 35 years, largely that's died, and you're seeing it on speed in Ukraine. The only way that we're going to prevail in the future is to find a way of engaging with academia, with industry, with technology, with innovation, because the big platforms, the big primes, yes, they build these amazing warfighting machines, but there's not too much rapid innovation there, and that's something we're going to have to focus on.
Interesting. And that's another area we could get into in detail. Finally, and briefly, you've been commentating on this and other conflicts around the world. The world is becoming more and more unstable. Do you think we're on a path to regional or global conflict?
No.
Okay.
That was succinct.
That was very clear and succinct.
And I want to qualify that because in my time in the Ministry of Defence, the two driving threats were Russia and China. I think China's watched what's happened with this conflict. I can't see it feeling emboldened. Might feel emboldened around Taiwan, but that's another story for another day. Russia, we thought was a very credible, dangerous threat. In reality, it has struggled to do something that you and I would have thought was relatively simple for a nation that size. The war isn't over, and yes, there's lots of positives that Russia could take, but the big picture is Russia is no match whatsoever for NATO, and therefore, in a way, whilst it feels dangerous, as long as we've got time to reconfigure and get ourselves bristling again, stand out in that wall with a degree of credibility, no, I don't think we're on the border of some sort of global conflict.
Well, Keir Starmer, hopefully you're listening. We need to be bristling. Sean, it's been a real pleasure talking to you this morning on Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.